Good afternoon, members of the Public Accounts Committee, the Auditor General, you and your team from the Auditor General's office. Good afternoon too to the Senior Deputy Accountant General, sorry, my apologies, from the Ministry of Finance. And also good afternoon to you too, to our two witnesses, the Financial Secretary and the Accountant General. We gather this evening to examine a report that has been prepared by the Auditor General's Office. That report is entitled Improving Financial Accountability and Transparency, Financial Management and Reporting. Now, this report is the second of three reports that the Auditor General has prepared and is in the process of completing. The first report was surrounded the topic of budgeting, and that report was completed and examined by the former Public Accounts Committee. And this now is the very first report that this new committee is here to examine. So I welcome to all of the members of the Public Accounts Committee. We have one member who is returning from the previous previous Public Accounts Committee, but the others are all, if I might use the term, freshmen in terms of their participation and membership on this committee. I have to declare at the very outset that as chair, I am conflicted in the examination of this report. And the reason I am conflicted is the fact that this report was completed during my tenure as Minister of Finance and my connection with the Ministry of Ministry of Finance. And so it is right and proper that I exclude myself from any questioning of witnesses here today. And so my role as chair will simply be to lead us through this session and this meeting, and I will not participate in the asking of any questions of these two witnesses. So I will depend on my colleagues to my right to make sure that they cover all of the issues and all of the areas that are highlighted in this report. And there are a number of recommendations coming out of this report that the Auditor General has made, and so we need to make sure that we are thorough in all that we do. It is customary that before we actually begin the questioning of witnesses, that the Auditor General makes some brief introductory remarks with regard to the report that she has prepared to provide some flavor and context to it for not just for the committee, but for those who might be watching as well and listening to proceedings here this afternoon. So at this time, Madam Auditor General, I would turn things over to you and invite you to make your presentation.
That's better. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to you, members of the Public Accounts Committee, officials from the Ministry of Finance and the listening public. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make some opening remarks to this first hearing of the newly formed Public Accounts Committee. As you said, Mr. Chairman, the report we are considering here today is improving financial accountability and transparency, and it relates specifically to financial management and reporting. This was published in May 2021, and as you mentioned, it's the second in a series of three on improving financial accountability and transparency. The report covers three main areas. Firstly, financial management. Secondly, financial and performance reporting. And thirdly, financial performance at the entire public sector level. I'll very briefly summarise our findings in each of these areas. So in the first area, financial management, I'm pleased to say that this has improved significantly over the last decade, and particularly in the last 5 years. The Ministry of Finance has played an integral role in this improvement through its financial leadership. The Ministry has issued a number of policies, guidance and frameworks that aim to further strengthen financial management. However, the implementation of most of these remains work in progress, and we also identified some areas that would benefit from stronger financial leadership. It is pleasing to note that the government has responded to one of our long-standing recommendations to strengthen governance by establishing a core government audit and risk assurance committee in 2019, and we are seeing that this committee is already making a real difference. On the second area of financial and performance reporting, again, the quality of financial reporting for core government entities and statutory authorities and government companies has improved markedly. We have shifted from a position in 2013-14 where only 16 out of 42 entity financial statements where 16 out of 42 were qualified, to currently where all that we've audited in both 2019 and 2020 at an entity level, and that's the vast majority, have been given an unqualified or clean audit opinion. However, in respect to the entire public sector, or EPS consolidated account, there is still a way to go to improve the quality of financial reporting. The audit opinion on the EPS financial statements improved from disclaimed in 2013-14, but has remained an adverse opinion since then. There are a number of factors that contribute to this adverse opinion, and I have recommended that the Ministry of Finance develop a roadmap for improving the quality of the EPS financial statements that will allow me to provide an unqualified audit opinion at some point in the future. Another issue I've raised again in this report is the slow tabling of annual reports and financial statements in this House, as this severely limits transparency and the ability of decision makers, such as yourselves, to hold public entities to account for their financial performance. There has been some improvement here, and most notably in the sittings last week of the current meeting of Parliament, where a lot were laid. The third and final area of the report deals with financial performance. And this is at the EPS level, and specifically we look at the performance against the 6 principles of responsible financial management that are set out in the Public Management and Finance Act. These principles are the cornerstone of prudent financial management, but there is a lack of transparency of actual performance against these principles. This is due to delays in the EPS financial statements being audited and tables and figures not being updated. And again, I'm saying we have a partial responsibility on that, just to be clear. Our assessment is that core government performed well against most of the principles. However, I'd like to draw your attention to 2 areas in particular where further work's needed. The government plans for and reports that it meets the principle that net assets should be positive. However, this is because the EPS financial statements do not include the full liability for post-retirement costs of civil servants, one of the issues that contributes to the adverse audit opinion. The other issue I want to mention relates to the principles on net debt and cost of borrowing. A number of decisions have been taken recently, including the signing of the new public-private partnership contract for waste management and the use of the line of credit that will increase the level of borrowing, which will impact upon actual performance against these 2 principles. I've made a total of 16 recommendations in my report. One of the recommendations, number 8, is directed to the Parliament and aims to improve the timeliness of laying annual reports and financial statements. This will require the buy-in of all members of the House. I have here with me today to support you in the hearing Miss Angela Cullen and Gabriel Nakube, who undertook the audit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Auditor General. Before we begin our questioning this afternoon, I'd just like to, for the benefit of the public, to let you know that the committee has agreed that we will examine the 2 witnesses, the Financial Secretary, Kenneth Jefferson, and the Accountant General, Matthew Tibbetts, together. That is completely in accord with standing orders. And so at this point in time, I will go ahead and open the floor up for questions from the committee. Member for Georgetown South.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to our witness, the first question is, in paragraph 22, page 13, in the Auditor General's report states that the Minister of Finance and Economic Development provides functional leadership for finance across core government. However, paragraph 30 concludes that there is a scope to further improve guidance and functional leadership for finance, particularly in relation to implementing accounting and financial reporting standards, advice and guidance on complex financial transactions, and guidance on the financial implications of implementing legislation and policies. It provides 3 examples where MFED could have provided stronger central leadership. I'll just give one example. It relates to SAGC's compliance with Section 47 of the Public Authorities Act, and states that it is not clear to what extent the financial implications of this legislation has been considered or had been considered in advance, or whether any guidance was issued to support SAGCs in implementing it. For the public's information, Section 47 of the Public Authorities Act covers salary scales and job evaluation and had come into force in June 2019. This is one of the key audit matters that we reported in the Auditor General's General Report and contributed to a number of SAGs receiving an emphasis of matter paragraph in their 2019 audit opinion. So my first question is, can the Financial Secretary or the Accountant General state if there are any upcoming changes to accounting standards that may require leadership and direction from the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development?
Mr. Chairman, good afternoon and to you and honorable members of the committee. So I was just conferring with the Accountant General as to the best answer to the question, and certainly is the case if I go back a few seconds to the Public Authorities Law and Section 47. I'd just like to say for the benefit of the committee and the listening public that I think that particular exercise is if not complete, it's well on the way to being complete. And again, for the benefit of the viewing and listening public, that particular section of the law entails an exercise being done where the remuneration of staff in the statutory authorities and government companies are compared to their, as best as possible, equivalent positions within central government. And the requirement of the law was that the statutory authorities' remuneration become in line with those of central government. And that exercise, to the best of my knowledge, is essentially complete, barring 1 or 2 authorities. So that is good news, Mr. Chairman and committee members. I am not 100% certain as to the financial impact of that exercise, whether it has resulted in a tremendous change in the remuneration levels in the statutory authorities, because it was obviously the exercise was done on the basis that an existing public servant in a statutory authority was not going to be adversely affected if they were making $100,000 in a statutory authority and their equivalent position in central government was 95. They weren't going to be reduced to 95 because that was their equivalent position in central government. Mr. Chairman, in that particular instance, I not 100% certain as to the particular accounting advice that was necessary to be given by the Ministry of Finance. But I know the portfolio of the civil service led that exercise, and it's essentially complete. In terms, Mr. Chairman, of future legislation, we struggled a bit in when we conferred to foresee, what future legislation was upcoming, change in standards were upcoming that would require Minister of Finance to lead and give advice. We struggled with that. We certainly know that there was considerable change following the general election, change in the makeup of ministries and portfolios. So we now have a situation where we have 9 ministries being managed, being controlled by 8 ministers, and that there is an accounting standard that relates to the makeup of an organization and changes thereto. So we certainly are aware of that particular one. I'll ask the Accountant General if he has more to add.
May I ask to, sorry to interject myself, but just ask for sake of good order too that you state your name and position before answering.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't do that. Kenneth Jefferson, Financial Secretary and Chief Officer, Minister of Finance and Economic Development.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Matthew Tibbetts, Accountant General. In regards to the Public Authorities Act, Section 47, that was viewed as a governance issue, in which case the Deputy Governor and the portfolio of the Civil Service took the lead on that particular legislation in regards to writing it, as well as in regards to reconciling the remuneration between the two, between the public authorities and the central government. And so the Ministry of Finance involvement wasn't as heavy as may have been expected by OAG in this report. Further to the Finance Secretary's point as well, in regards to segment reporting, is a piece of a change in the accounting standards that has come up and that will affect us this year. Because of the reorganization of government, we have some consideration as to what constitutes new entities for the government, and therefore we'll be reviewing the standards as well as working with the Auditor General's office to ensure that we comply with the accounting standards in regards to the various segments and what constitutes a new entity versus a continuation of an existing entity. And we'll be giving that advice as well to CFOs. We've started the initial work, but we expect to continue some more to ensure that we have a thorough understanding ourselves, as well as ensuring CFOs follow through with the same approach. Thank you.
Thank you for that explanation. Through you, Mr. Chairman, again to our witnesses. So based on the fact that we are now preparing for the 2022-23 budget, can you indicate whether the Section 47 will be included into that in terms of the cost, the full cost, will be included into the budget for 2022-2023?
Mr. Chair, through you to the member. The last update I received was that the National Roads Authority was one of the only SAGCs outstanding for the revaluation of jobs that is lining them up with the central government equivalent. That was a few months back, and I haven't received an update since then. Presumably that would be either completed or near completion now, in which case all of the SAGCs would presumably be aligned with central government, and therefore for the 2022-2023 budget, the adjustments would be included. However, I can't speak for the portfolio of the Civil Service and the Deputy Governor's Office, as it is the Deputy Governor's Office and the Portfolio of Civil Service that was really heading the reevaluations up. They're coordinating everything, as well as I think they may have actually been conducting some of the valuations themselves for the smaller entities. So I would have to rely on the Chief Officer of the Portfolio of Civil Service for that.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just, with your permission, just add briefly to what the Accountant General has just said, to make a point that whilst the remuneration level within central government I'll be a bit cagey and say should not change by virtue of the Section 47 exercise, and therefore, one could conclude, well, it isn't going to have an impact on government. That wouldn't be quite true, obviously, because if the statutory authorities' remuneration levels are changing because of that exercise, many of the statutory authorities, the significant and larger ones, many of those authorities provide services to the government, for which the government then pays those authorities providing those services. So if the underlying remuneration level changes within those authorities, it does have a feed-through effect on central government, and so we should see it in an increased cost as a possibility for the level of output funding payments to statutory authorities for the services that they provide. So that would be the mechanics of how it would impact the government. And to be brutally honest, I don't think when we were carrying out the SPS process that was a explicit consideration that we had in central government as to the impact of that exercise on those SPS levels. It may very well be the case that the statutory authorities submitted their estimates of the cost of their services to their particular ministries, and we in turn in the Ministry of Finance simply accepted to a great degree the returns from ministers and portfolios which may have been inclusive of the impact of this exercise.
Thank you again for that explanation. Through you, Mr. Chairman, one last question on financial management is another example where MFED could have provided stronger central leadership is in the draft dividend policy. MFED issued a new dividend policy in 2019, but some SAGCs interpreted the guidance differently. The report states that MFED was updating the guidance and formula for calculating the dividend payable, and a more strategic approach was needed to address this. Can one of the witnesses provide a progress report in updating the dividend policy?
Mr. Chair, through you. The dividend policy was, as you said, was issued in 2019. However, there was some ambiguity in regards to some of the terminology in regards to what it was to be considered restricted cash. And therefore, the Ministry of Finance recently, in 2021, issued a specific formula in Excel format. So it's actually, we did a template in Microsoft Excel that allows SAGCs to simply enter the information, select yes or no, and therefore the dividend is automatically calculated. At this point, I can't say it's completely, as they say, foolproof, but it is pretty straightforward and very precise with what is considered restricted cash, as well as what dividends should be paid. So we saw the gap in the policy, and we ensured that we provided a template to follow to address the weakness in the initial policy that was issued. And so now we actually have the dividend calculation very straightforward, so that we don't see the initial issue as a major problem anymore. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, sorry, I just keep adding to what has been said. One of the, just for the benefit of the committee, one of the sort of side issues or complications that we have experienced recently on the application of the policy, of the dividend policy, is that one or two of the statutory authorities and government companies have said that the need to account for post-retirement healthcare liability is a new factor, and they are provisioning for those costs and essentially setting aside amounts to cover those post-retirement benefits in the future, and arguing that that need to provide for the future restricts the amount of cash that they can pay over to central government. And so that's I just add that for the committee's knowledge and benefit, that it is a complication that we see emerging, and that is the argument that's being put forward. And it has been used to say that although our profit levels may be at a particular level and may be robust, when we set aside a provision to cover for this retirement obligation in the future, then once we set that aside and build for the future, there's, in simple terms, there's precious little left to hand over to government as a dividend. So it is something that we would need to address further.
Other questions from members of the committee? Member for West Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good
Central.
afternoon to the witnesses. I have a question in relation to the financial management. I'll just read here from page 2 of the report. Says the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development has improved its financial leadership across government and the wider public sector. Over the past few years, the ministry has issued a number of new policies and guidance that will help strengthen financial management across government once they are fully implemented. In 2017, the ministry started to develop a public finance manual and issued 2 of 4 parts in 2018. The remaining 2 parts were due to be issued in January 2019, but this has not yet happened. And I was just wondering if you could advise on that, if there have been any further developments.
Mr. Chair, through you. The Public Finance Manual, as stated, we've gotten halfway through the manual. We have work in progress for one of the other sections of it, so that would get us up to 3/4. So 3 of the 4 sections. However, we have not issued that yet. Unfortunately, we've been extremely busy in the ministry, and so we had to delay it, unfortunately. And then we were hit with COVID and the various complications that brought as well. So we have gotten behind a bit on that. We did have specific plans to try to get it rolled out within a specific time frame, and unfortunately, we've actually been delayed on that. We do expect it to be completed in the near future. It's something we do consider a priority, and it's unfortunately something that had to be pushed on the back burner temporarily, but it is definitely something we consider a high priority for us.
Thank you. I have one more question under this section. It's actually just in relation to the key messages that was provided by the Auditor General. I noticed that on page 2, there's mention of 18 recommendations aimed at improving financial management and reporting that was made in the 2013 report. 5 had been fully implemented and 6 partially implemented. Just wondering if you could speak on the other 7 recommendations briefly.
Mr. Chair, through you. Thank you for the question. We appreciate that. It allows us the opportunity to actually provide some clarity to this point. The Auditor General initially did a report in 2013. In early 2014, the Deputy Governor, along with the Financial Secretary, commissioned a group called the Public Management Finance Law Review Committee, so the PMFL Review Committee. And that committee then took a look at the Auditor General's recommendations, not just the ones in 2013, but also other recommendations made, as well as looking at the PMFL, that is the Public Management Finance Law, overall, and considered additional changes. That committee took the Auditor General's report, the 13 recommendations, and then they added an additional number of recommendations for a total of 40 recommendations. Of those 40 recommendations, I believe it was 19 required legislative changes, and I believe all of those have been made. I don't have the exact breakdown now. I believe it's 19 have been made. There were the remaining ones did not require legislative changes, but they did require changes, and so I believe it was 9 or 10 of those that have now been actioned as well. So while the Auditor General's report refers to a 2013 report, that report was then rolled into the Public Management Finance Law Review Committee report, and numerous changes have been made since the initial report in 2013 and since the PMFL Review Committee in 2014. I'll have to take a look at the exact items that remain outstanding, because the majority of those items plan to be addressed through a working group which we've established, which will look at budgeting and reporting. That committee has had 3 meetings now and temporarily put on hold due to elections and the SBS. And so now that we've gotten through the SBS, we can again begin our meetings. And that committee then will address a number of changes, because the changes that were, the recommendations that were made, while they appeared quite simple in our audit report, they're actually quite complex. For example, one of the recommendations was that we move away from output reporting and move towards input and outcome reporting. And that is definitely not a small change at all. It requires that we take our current framework and completely restructure it to be reporting on outcomes, not on outputs. The working group is to, first of all, review all those recommendations and get guidance from the best practice that stands now. We've had a few consultations with the experts in the field who focus on outcome reporting and so on, and their recommendation is that we don't actually move away from output reporting, for example, but rather that output reporting is a step towards outcome reporting. And so while a recommendation may say something as simple as move towards outcome reporting, we need to ensure that we do it correctly the first time and ensure that we also have the systems in place that allow us to measure those outcomes. Because something we found when we implemented the current framework was that we didn't have systems in place to measure it. And that meant for a number of years, government was unable to produce information to show what we were producing. So basically it came down to us trying to calculate outputs that we produced, and it was not done really well in the first few years. It's something we got a bit better at as we tried to develop some systems, but at the onset we did not have the systems in place. That's just an example of one of the recommendations that were made, but the remainder of those recommendations will be reviewed by the working group, the budget and reporting working group, and we consider it to be part of an overall review of the framework, and as well as ensuring the system is in place to properly report on the outcomes, as that is one of the overarching recommendations. So.
Sorry. Mr. Chairman, I wanted just to add on to what the Accountant General has said. Appendix, I think the Honourable Member was making reference to Appendix 1 in the Auditor General's report, where the past recommendations are listed. And if I could see by just flipping the pages, there were two areas that I distinctly turned out to be marked as no, meaning no, they had not been implemented. And if I just take as an example number 8, I'll try not to be too long on this one. The distinction between executive and entity transactions should be removed, and other compensating balances introduced. Mr. Chairman, obviously you will be familiar with this, but there are quite a few members of the committee who are not familiar with it and are new to the committee. just briefly, this distinction between executive and entity transaction, I'll do my best to make it quick and simple. We now have, Mr. Chairman, we now have 18 core ministry entities within that make up central government. So we have 9 ministries. We have the Judicial Office, we have the DPP, we have the Cabinet Office, we have the Parliament, we have the Commissioner of Police, etc. Those total 9, along with the 9 ministries, give us 18 core entities, core government entities. Each of those 18 entities produce their own set of financial statements, and the Auditor General issues an opinion on each of those 18. And thus far, all of those opinions are clean, unqualified, the accounts can give a true and fair view, etc. Those financial statements deal with what is referred to as entity transactions, meaning those transactions that the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Tourism, as examples, Ministry of Education, those transactions which those underlying 18 entities get involved with that are necessary for their own individual operations. And so it typically involves on the expense side, paying salaries, etc. And on the revenue side, it is obtaining revenues from the executive, being cabinet, paying the Ministry of Health for the services it provides to the cabinet, as an example. So those entity transactions are what the individual, excuse me, 18 entities need to get involved with to do their day-to-day business. Distinct from the entity transactions are transactions referred to as executive transactions that belong uniquely to the cabinet as a whole. So transfer payments, social welfare payments, as an example, we will not find those in an individual ministry financial statements. Those are referred to separately as executive transactions. So the Public Management and Finance law does actually make a distinction between these two types of transactions. And the entity transactions are placed in the individual ministry portfolios, financial statements, whereas the executive transactions, so customs duties, customs revenues, fees that are collected by SEMA, stamp duty revenues, etc., are the domain of the cabinet, and those are executive transactions. None of the executive transactions appear in those individual 18 ministries and portfolios. They belong to the cabinet. The law, the act, makes a distinction between the two types of transactions. The recommendation is that we do away with that distinction. And so you don't get that happening anymore, where you get 18 entities with their own unique set of transactions and they do not incorporate the executive. The recommendation is that that distinction be removed. The further consideration that is not yet decided is, do we place those those executive transactions into the individual 18 sets of financial statements, and you make the Ministry of Financial Services, as an example, responsible for all of the fees that SEMA now collects? Or do we just produce one set of financial statements for the government as a whole? That debate hasn't concluded, and we need to make progress on that. Mr. Chairman, I put that forward as one area in which the answer to implementation was no, just as an illustration to the committee, as some of the more problematic and long-standing issues that still have not been resolved from the 2013 recommendations.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, through you. I initially started to talk about the chronological order of how these things transpired. In 2000, so let me just finish that up to give you the perspective of where the Ministry of Finance is with these things. In 2013, the Auditor General prepared their report. In early 2014, Deputy Governor and Financial Secretary commissioned the PMFR Review Committee that committee made 40 recommendations. In 2015, a number of the legislative changes that needed to take place were made to the PMFL. The PMFL is now the Public Management and Finance Act, so PMFA now. And then in 2017, an additional number of changes were made to the legislation at that time. That left us with a number of changes that needed to be made, including what the Financial Secretary just spoke to. But all these changes that are left, the majority of them would be included under the Budget and Reporting Working Group that we had established. And that was established in 2018. Upon establishing the working group in early 2018, the Auditor General's office advised us that they would be conducting an audit on our budgeting and reporting, this is actually one of those reports. We did wait for some time and followed up regularly to see how long those reports would take. It turns out those reports, we've only gotten 2 now, and so we're now 3 years on from where we had initially started. And I took the decision in 2018, when we were advised that an audit would take place, to delay the working group, as we expected to see a number of recommendations from the Auditor General's office, and we could then include those into the recommendations that we're already considering. And so we're at the point now where we're continuing with the working group based on the 2 reports we have received. We received one in December, and the other one, I believe this was January, this one? May of this year. And so we're taking these into consideration in the Budget and Reporting Working Group. Unfortunately, it's taken us some time to get these reports. So we were delayed by about 2.5 to 3 years waiting on these reports as well. So that is some of the reason for the delay as well. But we're ready to go forward now to make the changes. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just to say thank you to the witnesses. I have no further questions under financial management.
So,
Member
Chair.
for Boddentown East.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I just want to follow up on the information provided by the Accountant General in asking how long was this working group meeting?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, through you. Just to confirm, you're referring to the Budget and Reporting Working Group that I mentioned we had established initially in 2018? Okay, so just to again reemphasize, we had initially set up the working group in early 2018, May 2018. However, we postponed it because the Auditor General advised they'd be conducting an audit. We thought it prudent to ensure that we included any new recommendations into the any revisions we made to the framework. And so we placed that group on hold. The group has met 3 times. Our first meeting, I believe, was February of this year, and a second one in mid-February, and I believe the third one was early March. Initially, the members of the group were made up of the Ministry of Finance staff. We had, I believe, 5 members of the Ministry of Finance staff, the Finance Secretary, the Accountant General, myself, my Deputy Accountant General, as well as the Senior Assistant Financial Secretaries, that is Ann Owens and Michael Nixon, as well as a representative from the Audit Office and a member from the private sector. However, we found that was because we have so much guidance from the Auditor General's office on changes we should make, as well as we expected to be considering the use of a consultant for some of the work. We thought that the Ministry of Finance, our thinking now is that the Ministry of Finance can proceed, and then we'll get feedback for the best practices for example, outcome reporting and so on, basically the best practice standards for public sector, which would give us the benefit of having a third pair of eyes outside of the Ministry of Finance, as well as we obviously already have the recommendations of the Auditor General's office. And so this, going forward now, it'll be taken forward by the working group in the Ministry of Finance.
Are there any other questions from the committee with regard to this section? Member Freeston? No, sir? Okay. There are no further questions on this section, then we will turn our attention now to financial and performance reporting, which is the second area the Auditor General mentioned. Questions? Member for Boddentown East.
Thank you, and I'll say good evening to the committee. Good afternoon to the listening public. Mr. Chair, to give some context in terms of the financial performance reporting, paragraph 47 to 52 on pages 21 and 24 conclude that the quality of the EPS financial statements has improved from a disclaimed audit opinion in 2012 to 13 to an adverse audit opinion in the 4 years of 2013, 14 to 2016, 17. However, Mr. Chair, much more needs to be done to move the audit opinion to qualified and then unqualified, as a significant number of deficiencies remain in the financial statements. And it highlights that the deficiencies in the EPS consolidated financial statements includes the following, Mr. Chair. Figures being based on draft financial statements of subsidiaries, although the quality and timeliness of these has improved significantly. Many core government entities having poor internal controls of their management of coercive revenues, not including the full liability for pensions and health care. No systems in place to ensure the accuracy of related party disclosures, value of property, plant and equipment, completeness of provisions including environmental liabilities. So Chair, the OAG has recommended that the MFED should develop and implement an action plan to improve the quality of the EPS consolidated financial statements, that it provides a roadmap for moving to a qualified and then unqualified audit opinion. Mr. Chair, what I would love to ask is the witnesses, Financial Secretary in particular, is what are the barriers to improving the EPS consolidated financial statements?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the honourable member for that question. I'll probably need the assistance of the Accountant General as well. I think I'll start with what I consider to be, what we consider to be the single largest, most significant factor that has caused an adverse opinion. And if I digress for a few seconds, it just links in with what we were saying previously, where the 18 individual ministries' portfolios are getting clean opinions. But when you put those 18 entities together with 26 statutory authorities and government companies to get the entire public sector as one organization, and the Auditor General issues an opinion on the entire public sector, that opinion is an adverse opinion. So I've said it many times, Mr. Chairman, the public can be forgiven for being confused where the individual parts are getting clean opinions. But when you put the clean individual parts together, there is an adverse opinion. It doesn't seem quite right. And the reason why it's still right though for the adverse opinion to be given is because there are certain unique items that appear in the consolidated financial statements that are not in those individual 18 sets of financial statements. One of the most significant is the recognition of the post-retirement health care liability number, and also the recognition And so that impacts the balance sheet of the entire public sector. It is a liability, and the liability is of such a magnitude. I think, was it 2.6? Mr. Chairman, I think we do have a fairly current actuarial valuation of that liability figure that gave the value at the 31st of December 2020. Mr. Chairman, it's somewhere in the region of 2.6 billion, 2.5 billion as a liability number. It's so significant that it would wipe out all of the net asset, the assets of the government, and cause a net liability position. That liability figure, some details of the actuary's valuation is included in a note to the financial statements, but it's not shown on the face of the financial statement. It's not shown in the asset section, in the liability section of the balance sheet. It's not there. It's in a note. That $2.6 billion is obviously a very significant number, and that is one of the principal reasons for the Auditor General issuing an adverse opinion on the entire public sector. Mr. Chairman, I know that when you were the Minister for Finance, it was something that the recognition of it was something that you wanted to pursue. I know that for a fact. We had meetings. You told us what your position was. Unfortunately, the support wasn't necessarily there for you to proceed with it, but although I know you wanted to do that. So it is failure to recognize on the face of the financial statements that liability number. It is a failure to recognize the income impact of that same topic in the income statement of the government as reason. Is perhaps the principal reason for the adverse opinion by the Auditor General. There are several other reasons, but that area is one big area. Mr. Chairman, what we were having a discussion on very recently, and I'll conclude and I'll ask the Accountant General to continue, is that very interestingly, the opinion letter from the Foreign Commerce and Development Office recently, where the government wrote to the Foreign Office, asking for permission to proceed with tabling the SPS, the Strategic Policy Statement for 22 to the 24 period, in which the letter to the Foreign Office indicated that there would be a deficit for the 2021 year, and it was seeking permission for 22 to 24, in which there were surpluses. The response coming back from the Foreign Office was essentially they didn't see the surplus deficit as an issue, because the framework for fiscal responsibility mentions three ratios: the debt servicing ratio, the cash reserves ratio, and the net debt ratio. But the surplus deficit consideration was not mentioned. In fact, the letter said that they felt as though it was unnecessary for the Cayman government to have written to them to seek permission. It wasn't necessary. So saying all that to say this, we are considering amongst the Ministry of Finance staff whether that can be taken, Mr. Chairman and members, whether that could be taken to suggest that if we were to bring the liability number onto the balance sheet of the government at an EPS level, and it created a negative net worth, negative net asset situation, if we were to include the impacts of it in our income statement and it created a deficit, what would the view of the Foreign Office be to that move? So that's something that we've considered and not necessarily concluded on it I think our feeling within the Ministry of Finance staff is that we would like to bring those things onto the primary accounts. But we have to take it to a political level. And that hasn't happened as yet, because the Foreign Office letter was dated the 13th of July. So it's pretty fresh, pretty recent. So that, Mr. Chairman, was a very long discussion about one aspect, one reason why there's an adverse opinion at an EPS level, but there are quite a few others, and the Accountant General will continue on.
Mr. Chair, through you. Leading on from what the Financial Secretary mentioned in regards to merging the executive and entity orgs for each ministry, I don't want to underscore the importance of this aspect of our framework and the significant impact this has on us actually getting a clean opinion. At the Ministry of Finance level, the EPS level as we call it, we're basically consolidating accounts from all the ministries and SCGCs across government. If all of the ministries and all the SCGCs had clean accounts in both their entity and executive books, the EPS would have a clean opinion. However, because ministries are only reporting on what we call the entity level, which is basically the child level, you have a parent and child relationship in their financials, they're only reporting on the child at the child's level. So they're not reporting on the executive level or the parent level, which includes all of the coercive revenue. So all of the customs duties, all of the stamp duty on land transfers, all the TAT, the tourism accommodation taxes, all the coercive revenues are actually not being audited at the ministry level. And so one of the changes we want to make is to merge the executive or the parent with the entity or the child set of books, because there's two set of books right now. We want to merge them together into one so that each ministry will have to get a clean opinion on both their entity and executive books. The public is now seeing that ministries are getting clean accounts, but it is only on the entity or the children's accounts. If they had clean opinions on the parent or the executive level, then when we do our consolidation, all we're doing is eliminating transactions. Realistically, that should be a small exercise because they should have done it correct. If they've done it correctly, we shouldn't have any eliminations. So I don't want to underscore the importance of that change to merging the executive and the entity orgs. Once we get there, realistically, ministries will probably see, will probably go back to some qualified accounts until each ministry cleans up their executive books and moves it so that each ministry has an unqualified opinion again. And then at that stage, we'd expect to see the EPS have an unqualified opinion. But realistically, us as the EPS level, the overall parent, there's no way we can get clean books until we get it at the ministry level. And so the roadmap, bringing it back to the report, we know what needs to be done. We've started on a number of these. Just to give you some examples, in 2016, we commissioned a valuation of all of government's real property. So this is all the buildings, all the land, all the large equipment, and so on. That was an exercise we conducted for the entire public sector. The Ministry of Finance funded it for central government as well as for all public authorities. So Health Service Authority, National Roads Authority, CIAA, everyone, Ministry of Finance took that on. We took the lead and said we want to get this correct on the books. Unfortunately, the roads network still needed some work, and so that that valuation exercise that was conducted in 2016 is now due to be conducted again. And so we've already started it because it's every 3 to 5 years you have to conduct it. So as of January this year, we started the valuations as the 5-year period has now expired, 4.5, 5 years. And so we're ensuring now that we get the roads network correct as well as valuations. So that'll help to correct one of the major issues we've had. Realistically, the Ministry of Finance shouldn't have to. We would expect everyone to have the valuations, follow the accounting standards, but we haven't seen that. And I understand why, because we're coming out of a centralized environment, moving to a decentralized. Obviously, this has been years in the works now, but it's something we need to figure out as we go along. And so the Ministry of Finance is taking the lead on some of these initiatives. Another one is in regards to revenue recognition. We have advised CFOs for the last few years that we're going to be merging the executive and the entity orgs. So we're asking them to ensure that their executive revenue is accurate and complete. And we actually created a framework and provided training to CFOs to ensure that they actually were improved on the completeness of their revenue. And it's something that they're working on as we speak. Some of them are working with internal audit services to ensure that they get it right. And so we want to ensure that they can get to the point of getting their revenue complete before we do, well, we'd like to have it so that before we merge executive and entity orgs, that their revenue is accurate. However, there may be some that have not gotten to that point when we do the merger. The other items, as the Finance Secretary mentioned, in regards to the post-retirement healthcare liability, that has been a major issue and still is $2.6 billion. Additionally, one of the items that has been outstanding is the pensions liability and the recognition of that. Historically, the Ministry of Finance at the EPS level, we've always recognized that liability on our books. We have recognized it. However, the Auditor General's office wanted us to, what we call, gross those amounts up to show the full amount of assets and the full amount of liabilities separately. However, at the EPS level, we netted those two amounts, and the standards allow us to do that, which gives you the same impact, which is a liability. So we have a certain amount of assets, a certain amount of liabilities, and we netted those together to show that we have a net liability. The Auditor General's office wanted us to show them separately. We didn't feel that was correct, because the assets that we're referring to are those of the Public Service Pensions Board. So the Auditor General's office wanted us to show the assets of the Pensions Board on our books, and we didn't think that's correct. We don't feel like those are our assets. However, we did think it was correct to show the liability. More recently, the Auditor General's office, I believe after some discussion with the Public Service Pensions Board, I believe the Auditor General's office, I'm understanding now, has agreed to allow us to proceed with the net amount on the books without having to show the gross amounts of the gross assets and the gross liabilities. That's my most recent understanding from the Audit Office. And so that's a change that on the Auditor General side to allow us to move forward or move closer to a cleaner opinion. So in summary, as I've jumped around a bit, just to say that we have a roadmap. We agree with the Auditor General's recommendation in that we need to start pulling those together now and bringing them to a close. But we do see a major step in that roadmap as merging the executive and entity orgs for each ministry. We see that will have a major impact on the EPS accounts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, thank you, and I want to say that was quite a comprehensive response. I thank you so much. But one of the things that you mentioned, or Financial Secretary mentioned, was the 2.6 billion liability, which would be of concern to anyone and the whole country. I want you to help me here, because I know that there are some discussions in the past about the healthcare liability. Isn't it couldn't a decision be made in terms of restructuring of the healthcare plans to allow the liability to go down? Isn't that a conversation that has been had?
You can chip in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, understand the sentiment of the honourable member's question, but I think at the core of it, the value, the magnitude of the liability number is dependent upon or reflects the existing set of healthcare benefits that is actually awarded or afforded to civil servants. And so to reduce the liability number, yes, would entail essentially a reduction, a diminution, a dilution of some or all of those benefits. And I obviously believe then that we would get into a situation where, civil servants would object to it, and certainly would argue the point strongly that we were promised these benefits, we have contracts to this effect, and that it's therefore unfair for you to disturb those promised benefits now. But I certainly understand the honourable member's question, and he's right. You can reduce the liability number, but it would involve affecting those plans, and I think that's where the objection would come from. I hope I have understood his questioning.
Mr. Chairman, just to add to that, while it would be difficult to reduce the current liability, something that could be done to ensure that going forward over the longer term we have a reduced liability would be to change the benefit for future civil servants, as they don't have a commitment ongoing. They don't have a contract. It would be beneficial to consider changing it for future civil servants to say you don't have this lifetime benefit of free health insurance. And just for the public's knowledge as well, the two requirements to get the free health care is you have to have 10 years of consecutive service and to retire from the civil service. Obviously you have to hit 50 to retire from the civil service, but once you meet those two requirements, you get free health care for life, as well as your spouse and dependent children, obviously up to 18 and 23 if in education program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman, just add one more a point of detail, because it came to me, and just to illustrate how fairly generous the benefits are that civil servants enjoy under the health care that's services that's promised to them after retirement. I think the benefits that we enjoy, for example, are that over the lifetime of a civil servant, the value of those benefits can be $2.5 million, somewhere in that region, whereas an equivalent position of a private sector employee is probably half that. And so that type of disparity, that very generous set of benefits that we enjoy is some of the reasons, or is a big factor in explaining why the liability number is so high. So the range of services as well is it is healthcare, it is services for optical, it is dental, it is your spouse, it is quite fairly, and it's also medication, prescription medication. All of that would be paid for by government, and as the Accountant General has said, your spouse as well would all be paid for by government. I would perhaps not diminish the situation by saying that whilst the number is huge, it's not necessarily a liability that will crystallize tomorrow. But we keep saying that, to be quite honest. We keep saying that it's it's always in the future. It's always in the future, and it hasn't been addressed to date in a robust manner. I think that the Accountant General is right in saying that the one practical way forward would be you could change the set of benefits at a certain date going forward. You could change the existing set of benefits that we currently enjoy, but that would require the buy-in and the agreement of existing civil servants, and you know, those several thousand people, you would have to get their agreement to do so, which I think would be quite a task.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. This has been one of my pet peeves for many years, I must confess. Not that I want to take away any benefits from existing civil servants, but I would dare say that there begs a conversation in terms of the restructuring of how it's valued, in terms of instead of 2.5 million per employee, to be valued a bit differently. And I'm not sure how cynical plays a part in this, but we definitely need to exhaust all avenues. I don't know if an evaluation has been done in terms of what it actually costs for employees who have retired in the past. I'm sure that you all probably have some data on that.
Mr. Chair, through you, sir. I don't recall the exact number, but the portfolio civil service covers this expense on a pay-as-you-go basis kind of situation. It's, I believe the output is SIN 1 under the portfolio of civil service, and I believe it's now around 30 million per year, if memory serves me. And as we say, it's kind of a pay-as-you-go, so we're paying as we go along and covering the expense. But that's for the retirees. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So, Chair, I want to thank the witness for that answer, but I still want to go on record as saying that I would hope that they would look into the restructuring of the plans and try to see how we can get some of the plan with Cineco or something to hold the rest of the liability, so that I'm sure that not everyone, in the policy is using up the full amount of the full 2.5 million per person that is estimated. There must be some way that we can look at that, but I agree with the Accountant General that we need to look at the way forward and what we do with employees going forward who are not employed right now. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a crave you and the committee's indulgence, and it's an important thought that just crossed my mind, in that I wouldn't want the media to report that it's definite that the lifetime benefit enjoyed by civil servants is the figure that I mentioned of $2.5 million. It could be a completely different figure. It could be 5 million. I don't have that report with me to say. I can certainly let the committee have that number. What I was saying that for was to illustrate that the civil service plan is significantly more generous than what is in the private sector, and it could be of the magnitude of twice as generous. So I don't want it, reported that it is a particular number. I can get that number and report it back to the committee, but it was said for illustrative purposes.
Other questions? Member from Savannah?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the annual reports, performance reporting, continuing with questions, says paragraphs 53 to 60 states that entities have produced an annual report to accompany their financial statements since 2016-2017. However, the quality of these varies significantly, and they do not provide all the information required by the IPSAS, which are the accounting standards prescribed by the PMFA for core government and EPS. This makes it difficult for readers to determine how financial performance and service performance are linked, if at all. The Office of the Auditor General recommended that all annual reports provide an assessment of performance against the outputs and outcomes that are agreed in budget documents. This is recommendation 5. MFED has committed to implementing this recommendation by February 2025. Can the Financial Secretary say what actions are needed to provide an assessment of performance against agreed outputs and outcomes in annual reports?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to thank the honourable member for the question. I'm going to ask the Accountant General to provide the answer. I'll just say preliminarily that the Ministry of Finance itself has made, if you like, a pro forma annual report available to all ministries as to what the annual report should include, the type of items it should include. Not to suggest that the Ministry of Finance is all perfect, but to give an indication to other ministries as to the type of information that should be included within the annual report. We've done that, and I'll let the Accountant General fill in the details.
Mr. Chairman, through you. As I mentioned earlier in the session today, when the current framework was initially established, we introduced outputs. However, we didn't have systems to measure them. And the result of that was we had a few years where we didn't have output reporting, nor did we have financial statement reporting. In order to give the financial teams some time to get their financial accounts caught up, we placed output reporting on hold to allow them time to focus on getting the financial statements right, because it was a large shift from where we were to output reporting, as well as at the same time changing from cash to accrual accounting. So there's a massive shift. And you recall probably about 15 years ago, the headlines in the newspapers were constantly filled with issues with government's accounts not being able to be produced at all. And so to alleviate that pressure, we placed the output reporting on hold. And as I mentioned, the systems were not in place to report on them. However, as the Auditor General's Office has recommended, despite the fact that we have the outputs, realistically, the outputs we have don't do a good job of capturing what we're producing. For example, some of our outputs have a measure of the amount of hours of policy advice provided. Now, all that requires is someone to be at their desk producing some advice, but no real tangible result. We don't see the benefit to the average person on the street. How did that benefit us? How did that give us a healthier population? How did that give us a more educated population? How did that improve the quality of life or reduce the cost of living? We don't actually see any benefit from those. And so reporting on outputs, while we appreciate that we're supposed to be producing something, we have not done a good job with those outputs. And as we put in the report, the working group, the budget It's called the Reporting and Budgeting Working Group. That committee is now going to be taking a look at the current framework that is based on outputs and moving towards outcome reporting. We feel that's a much better value for the public to know, so they can actually see the improvement a government has made during their time in office. And while output reporting, I fully agree that we have not done a good job reporting on that at all. We feel confident that once we have a new framework in place, we can move to reporting on outcomes and ensuring that we have the systems. That's why we're taking some time to ensure that we actually set up the systems in place before we come up with the measures for the outcomes, so that we don't find ourselves in a situation like we had 15 years ago where we're unable to produce both output reports as well as financial statements. So we just want to ensure that we follow the right process and able to give the public the best information possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to the witness, I noticed that the proposed implementation date of February 2025 for outputs and outcomes are currently agreed for each entity as part of the budgeting process. Can you give us more details?
Mr. Chair, through you. The Reporting and Budget Working Group, we expect to have this ready for the budget cycle for the 25-26 year. Because it's an entire framework, we'll be meeting, so the Budget Reporting Working Group will be meeting. We'll make our decision on the best way forward. We then have to go out to get a consultant who is a specialist in governmental outcome reporting, if that is the way we choose to go, which based on OAG's recommendations as well as our own understanding of best practice as it stands, will be the way we go with outcome reporting. We have to get someone who's a specialist in this field to ensure that we can get those systems developed and put in place to ensure that when we do start for the 2025-2026 budget, that we have it right from the very start. I would like to say we'll actually have it before then, but we have it listed at a later date, and we do hope to deliver sooner than that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for that answer.
Member for Boddentown East.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I want to ask the Financial Secretary a question about paragraphs 70 to 74 and pages 28 to 29. It states that the government reintroduced quarterly reports in 2018, but it's not clear how or if they are used to inform decision making. And paragraph 73 in page 29 notes that information provided to the Parliament and the public on public finances changed significantly during the year, depending on the source of information. For example, in October 2020, Parliament was informed that the projected deficit for 2020 was 168 million, but the third quarter report to the end of September had estimated a deficit of 32.2 million. Mr. Chair, the question I want to ask the Financial Secretary in particular, and I guess the Accountant General can chime in, is what was the reasons for the differences between the figures included in the quarterly reports and projected deficit reported to the Parliament in October 2020, and also connected what was the final outcome in December 2020 as to the deficit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'll start, and it's likely that the Accountant General will fill in the detail. I'll start by saying, Mr. Chairman, that the quarterly reports of the government, the quarterly financial reports of the government, we've obviously done the first one for this year, although 2021 is not the year in question that the Honourable Member asked about. We've done one, the March quarter. June has just finished, and just for the members' knowledge and the listening public, the quarterly reports then are due within 6 weeks after the end of a particular quarter has ended. So we expect to have the June 30th, 2021 quarter, gazetted in the middle of August, thereabouts. I would also make the point too, Mr. Chairman, that the quarterly reports are going to be reporting actual expenditures, actual revenues, as opposed to projections. So I don't expect that there'll be a lot of end-of-year projections in the quarterly reports. The discrepancy that the report details and the Honourable Member has asked about, that discrepancy of just reading from page 29 and paragraph 73, where it says that it was reported to Finance Committee that the projected deficit for 2020 was 168 million, and a number of supplementaries were made based on this projection, and it's not clear why the projected deficit in October 2020 of 168 was so different from the deficit of 32.2 at the end of September, or the final outturn of 38 million at the end of December. Mr. Chairman, I would answer that basically and fairly by saying that to a large extent, we in the Ministry of Finance, we do get into tussles with other ministries, portfolios, and offices in terms of what their projections are. And we do fight, and we do try to persuade and dissuade unrealistic projections from occurring. At the end of it all, oftentimes the ministries, portfolios, offices have the mindset that they're very reluctant to give up their budget appropriations for the fear of, if I don't spend it this year, I'm going to have a reduced budget for the same item in the following year, and therefore I better maintain that I'm going to spend every last penny that is available to me as a budget, and therefore the projections are the projections of expenditures are higher than they turn out to be. There are certain areas within government's operations that are we've seen them underspend their budget projections year after year. One category is definitely personnel emoluments, personnel costs. We have underspends just about every single year that I can remember. And it's done on the basis that recruitments of staff don't always take place as originally planned. It is often the case as well that even if a planned recruitment of staff were to occur in September of the year, we could very well have an entire year's 12 months of budget being included, as opposed to just a few months from September to the end of December. That is fairly common. I think the significant area of underspend, Mr. Chairman and honourable members, would be in the area of capital expenditures. Are significantly underspent each and every year. Projects don't get started on time. Projects get stalled because of interjections of the need for an environmental impact study. There, often supply issues to capital expenditures, projects proceeding at the rate originally planned. So I would say definitely that capital expenditure areas are significant underspends traditionally every single year. Mr. Chairman, in terms of the deficit situation for 2020, from memory, when the pre-election and financial update document was done around March of this year, sorry, just prior to the election, so March 2021, we had a pre-election and financial update document done, and that document was gazetted in the middle of March. That document made an estimate for a deficit of 38 million for the year that ended December 2020. And I know that there's been some friction, if I can call it that, on the number. Mr. Chairman, I can say that that number that was reported was a number that was given to you, meaning that you did not fabricate the number. It was an invention by you. Similarly, the current Minister for Finance was given a number too that was different from the 38 million. So he too did not invent the number. He too did not fabricate the number, and it was substantially higher than the 38 million deficit for 2020 reported in the preview. In reality, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the likely deficit for 2020 is going to be somewhere in the middle of those two numbers. It's not going to be 38 million, and it's not going to be 87, 88 million, because those numbers, the 31st of December 2020 deficit is subject to audit, and adjustments are taking place, and there will be more adjustments. The audit office has not started its audit of the 2020 financial statements. I'm sure that process is going to give rise to further adjustments. Adjustments may increase and decrease the projected deficit. One item, Mr. Chairman, that comes immediately to mind in the discrepancy between the two numbers is after the March 2021 preview document was issued, and in it contained the 38 million deficit number. After that, so April, May, subsequent to middle of March 2021, subsequent to that, a particular ministry wrote off a further 10 million in respect of the 2020 year, and that 10 million write-off was reflecting a diminution in the value for cruise berthing. The costs had been accumulated over a number of years. The decision was taken that, the cruise berthing facility was not going to proceed. We were of the opinion that that particular transaction should have been more properly regarded as being something belonging to the 2019 year, but the ministry decided, well, we think we should write it off against 2020. That adjustment occurred after the middle of March. So the 38 million right away for one single item became 48 million. And there were other adjustments that kept pushing the number higher. And it is likely that there will be further adjustments again. And the number will end up somewhere between the 38 million and the 88 million. And that is, although that magnitude may seem great, and it's a 50 million gap, I've given just one item alone the 10 million, which accounts for a significant portion of that gap. So both Minister for Finances were reporting numbers that were provided to them.
And FS, if you don't mind me just thanking you for the clarity. Good, because you are correct, it has been a source of tension for a few weeks. And I do really acknowledge that and thank you for the clarity.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I really thank FS for that clarity. And I think some of what he was saying was, as we always recognize that the capital projects was not being realized, or funds were not being utilized. And ministries then, as he rightly said, no minister or no ministry wants to lose the funding for following years. So definitely appreciate what you're saying there. And I thank you for your response.
Member for West Bay Central.
I would just like to add my thanks to FS for the clarity, as it has been contention publicly, and as the public will now hear, the leader of the opposition was not being untruthful, and neither was our Deputy Premier. So thank you.
Are there other questions to come from the committee with regard to this subject matter on financial and performance reporting? No further questions? If not, then we can move on to the final area that we want to examine in this report, and that is financial performance. Are there any questions from the committee? Member for West Bay Central.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the witnesses, I just want to raise a question in relation to financial performance. Paragraph 96 or page 36 of the report, and I'll just read that for the listening audience. The Public Management Finance Act states that the Cabinet should manage the performance and financial position of core government, and that policies and decisions of the Cabinet should be consistent with the principles of responsible financial management. Section 14 of the PMFA prescribes the following 6 principles of responsible financial management for core government. Total expense should be less than total revenues, that is, an operating surplus. Total assets less total liabilities should be positive, that is, net worth should be positive. The cost of borrowing should not be more than 10% of revenue. The cost of borrowing is calculated for each financial year as the sum of interest, other debt servicing expenses, and principal repayments. Net debt should be no more than 80% of revenue. Cash reserves should be sufficient to cover at least 90 days of estimated expenses. And financial risk, including contingent liabilities, should be managed prudently. And my question comes from viewing Exhibit 5, the forecast compliance with the 6 principles of responsible financial management. And I was just looking at the fiscal year for 2014-15, the cost of borrowing, no more than 10% of revenue. And in that particular year, the debt servicing was over the 10%, it was 16.1. And also the same fiscal year, the cash reserves, no less than 90 days, and it was, it didn't comply with that requirement. And then also in 2019, we see where the debt servicing ratio was significantly higher than the 10%, it was 48.2%. So I was just wondering if FS, if you could just explain to me how we, as a government, comply with financial risk when the principle on debt servicing cost is not complied with in a fiscal year. And in particular, as we see in the 2014-15 forecast, not only was the cost of borrowing more than 10%, but we also did not comply with our cash reserves. Just for clarity in terms of being avoiding financial risk, sorry.
Thanks to the honourable member for asking the question. And Mr. Chairman, through you, sir, the member is quite right in that the financial year that ended the 30th of June 2015, which is referred to in the Exhibit 5 as the 14-15 year, we were not, the government of the day was not compliant with those two particular ratios. The debt servicing ratio was more than 10%, and the cash reserve days were less than 90 days. Just for the committee's knowledge and the public's understanding as well, the Public Management and Finance Act does say that where the government, any government of the day, sees that it's going to have a compliance issue, it can write to the Foreign Commonwealth Office with a plan to set out the circumstances, what its steps are in order to regain compliance with those 6 principles. In the government of the day that followed the 2013 general elections, there was non-compliance, and the Minister for Finance at the time, Minister Archer, took a plan to the Foreign Commonwealth Office in London setting out how compliance with these principles were going to be regained. And the Public Management and Finance Act allows, it mentions a period of time of 3 years, but it can be longer. So any government of the day can have up to three fiscal years, financial years, to regain compliance. The plan actually specified that the compliance would be regained by the 30th of June 2016, the very next year, which is the 15-16 year. And in Exhibit 5, there is compliance for that year for the 6 principles. So the compliance, so it was not the case that the principles were breached. The fraction is your interest costs and your principal repayments. Unless those were renegotiated, which I don't think they were, that top of your fraction is going to stay pretty constant and high. The revenue is what's going to change from year to year to year. Your denominator of the calculation is going to change. If that denominator, the revenue, was low, the ratio, the debt servicing ratio, was going to be relatively high and more than 10%. As our revenues improved, then that calculation, the fraction got better. and approached the 10% and went under the 10% because our revenues improved. And because our expenditures were probably quite high, then the amount of cash days that we had was less than the 90. As the economy picked up from that period onwards, revenues improved, the debt servicing fell until 2019. 2019 was a situation where the bond issue, the government's bond issue that it had taken out in 2009, which had a 10-year life, it matured in 2019 and it had to be repaid. Mr. Chairman, that was of the magnitude of quite a few million, $100 million. I think it might have been in the region of, is it 300? Is it 300 million? It's of the region of 300 million or so, sir. And that, because of how the wording of the debt servicing calculation, the interest and principal is on the top of the fraction. And if you're repaying principal of 300 million in 1 year, it's extremely difficult to comply with the 10% ratio, right? Your revenues would then have to be of the magnitude of 3 billion to be anywhere near close to being in compliance. And so it was a technical breach at the end of November 2019, and therefore December 2019, the debt servicing ratio was about the 10% because we had to repay this one-off event of the bond issue taken that was executed in 2009 and matured in 2019. And so that was a technical breach. And then the following year, 2020, there wasn't a similar recurrence of any so significant debt to be repaid, and so we would have fell back under the 10%. Is that CA or US? Mr. Chairman, the bond in 2009 was $312 million US, some of which was repaid by new borrowings, but quite a sizable portion was repaid from the government's existing cash balances at the time.
Just want to say thank you for your response.
Member for East End, I think you have some questions. Sure. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also want to thank the witnesses and thank the member of the public for listening and watching. One of the principles of responsible financial management, as my able colleague from West Bay Central went through early on, as defined in the PMFA, is that of core government entities have a positive financial position. That is, total assets should be more than total liabilities. Paragraphs 120 to 122, 123 to 126 state that because the government does not report the full liability of post-retirement costs in the entire public sector consolidated financial statements, that the actual performance against the principal is a net liability for the last 5 years. The Office of the Auditor General has also recommended that the government report the full value of the post-retirement obligations in the EPS consolidated financial statements. What are the reasons why the full liability and cost is not being reported in the financial statements to the Financial Secretary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the reason for the fact that and it is a fact that the post-retirement healthcare liability number is not reported squarely on the face of the balance sheet like any other liability, like any other asset. Government's bank account balances are reported on the face. The reason why it's not reported there, Mr. Chairman, is because of its magnitude. the magnitude of the liability number in the region of, I'm trying to recall accurately from memory, it's in the region of 2.5, 2.6 billion at the end of December 2020. And in the earlier years, it's going to be in the same ballpark figure, certainly $2+ billion. The reason why it's not reported, in my opinion, Mr. Chairman and members, is because if you were to, at least this is the thinking certainly at a political level. The thinking is that if you report it squarely on the face of the balance sheet and you reduce your net assets to a negative number, because the 2.6 is a liability number, and your existing assets now are not sufficient to cope with a deduction of 2.6 billion and end up with a positive number. So the principles in the Public Management and Finance Act require that when your liabilities are subtracted away from your assets, you should have a positive number. And if you subtract 2.6, 2.5, in earlier years it might have been 2.3 billion dollars from your assets, you were very likely you were going to end up with negative assets. Negative assets then was a situation where one of the principles of responsible financial management, one of those principles, that principle was going to be broken. It was going to be non-compliance with that principle. And the thinking was, well, if we get into that situation, we are going to have to go to London forever and a day, because we've broken that principle, to get approval for your annual budgets. And that was not a desirable way to go. And it added uncertainty. It added an extra dimension of time, and it was quite stressful to any government that found itself in that position. That was the thinking, and that persisted throughout the years, is the honest answer. Also, Mr. Chairman, that is the balance sheet side of the discussion on post-retirement healthcare. There's, as you know, sir, there's also the income side. There's an impact on your expenditure side. When you bring into account in any current financial year the fact that with 1 year of service by a civil servant, that 1 year of service, be it in 2021 or 2017, that 1 year of service is entitling, or is it enabling the civil servant to have an entitlement of future benefits when they retire. And so you should be accounting for that year of entitlement in that particular year. And so properly accounting for it would mean that your expenditure side as well would increase. And that add-on, that extra additional expenditure in any particular year could be in the region of $100+ million as an additional expenditure. And so, whereas we were reporting surpluses of $100+ million for many years, if you brought this on and took account of it on the face of the income statement, your surpluses could become deficits, because the additional expenditure that you would accrue would be of such magnitude that it would turn those surpluses into deficits. And therefore, that's another reason, that would be another principle that would be broken. The requirement to have a surplus would be not satisfied, and that would be another reason why you would have to worry about getting approval for your annual budgets. So the sort of the compromise was, we do the annual actuarial reports to find out what the number is, what the impact on our income statement is. We do that exercise, we have it done by an actuary, and we pay for it, and we put all the details in a note to the financial statement. So the knowledge is there, but it's simply not on the face of the primary set of financial statements. and it was for the fear of the impact it could have in terms of getting your annual budgets approved, because at least 2 of your principles were going to be broken.
Thank you for that, sir. Through you, Mr. Chair, just a clarity, I'm just going to read from paragraph 124 of the same Auditor General's report. It says the government reported liability of around $260 million for post-retirement healthcare costs in the 2019 EPS financial statements, which relates to the liability reported by some SAGCS. However, in the notes to the EPS financial statements, there's an additional figure of $2.3 billion disclosed, which is the actual valuation of the healthcare liability for core government of 2019. That was just for clarity, gentlemen, because he wasn't too sure if it was 2.5, 2.6, whatever. So it's just for clarity, gentlemen.
Member for
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if I could just crave your indulgence as well, because I keep remembering things. Just back to where I was a few seconds ago, to say that also there was a thought process that why should the Cayman Islands pursue this line of putting things squarely on the face of the balance sheet when not many of the I'll restrict it to not many of the, if any, of the other overseas territories were doing a similar thing. So why should the Cayman Islands be the odd one out, do the right thing, but there's a consequence to doing the right thing. You have to get external approval for your budgets.
Mr. Chair, I definitely agree with the Financial Secretary on that point. I just want to ask a question. I don't know. The $30 million that we talked about per se, that we pay out per annum, is it a payout? And is that to HSA or is that to Cynical? Or is it just the valuation of the...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just waiting to see if the Accountant General was going to reply. I think the 30 million that he mentioned, again, is from memory, so it don't hold him to the 30 million. But the central government would pay the Cayman Islands National Insurance Company, Cynical, would pay Cynical substantial amounts. It may be in the region of 30 million. I don't have a budget with me, but it may be in the region of 30 million, but the government would pay Cynical X million dollars for retired civil servants and public servants to be able to enjoy health care costs. And Cynical, in turn, when a retired person turned up at, for example, at the HSA to get care, the retiree would get that care. The government would have paid Cynical for it, and then the HSA would have will bill or invoice Cynical for that retiree, and then Cynical would pay the HSA for having provided that service. So in government's annual budgets, government is going to be paying healthcare costs for retirees as one separate budget line, which could be 30 million a year, and it's also going to be paying for seamen and veterans as a separate line, and it's going to be paying healthcare costs for existing civil servants as well. So I remember that some years ago we had created a spreadsheet of all the different healthcare costs that the government was paying for, and when you added up all those different areas, that was in the region of $100+ million per year, and that area healthcare cost was approximating 20% of the entire government's operating budget. And I don't think that that position has changed much. It's still going to be the current position. It is a substantial, so it is a substantial part of government's expenses. So if you take personnel costs, which would include the healthcare costs, if you take personnel costs and the cost of retirees and the cost of seamen and veterans, that is a substantial part of whatever government's total operating expenditure is on an annual basis. It's a substantial portion.
So, Mr. Chair, this is not policies and this is actual care. The 30 million, thereabout.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, bearing in mind that we don't have a budget in front of us, so it may be 30 million, it may be 29, etc. Yes, it would be care paid for. What happens, Mr. Chairman, is that Synico the Cayman Islands National Insurance Company would make an estimate as based on age what the annual premium would be for a person, a civil servant, a retiree, would say to government, our best estimate for the cost of providing these services for your set of people, civil servants and retirees, and there's a table given of premiums depending on your age and so forth, and so that is the bill or the invoice that the government would get from Synico. It may be the case that months could go by and the retiree may not avail himself or herself of the healthcare benefit, but the premium is nonetheless paid to Synico. So I'm kind of trying to refine your situation to say, yeah, it could be that that the Synico is being paid for 2 months, 3 months, for which that person may not avail themselves of health care, dental care, optical care, but the premium is still going there. Conversely, it could turn out to be the case that if the premium is $1,000, that retiree may take advantage, may have to receive those benefits, and the value of those services then might be $2,000 per month.
Are there any other questions from the committee? No? Okay. Member Freestone? But down east.
It started there with.
It's late in the day.
Mr. Chair, I think you're going to close because there's no more questions, but I just wanted to thank the financial secretary and the accountant general, the ministry in general, the broad civil service for all the great work that they do. I know this is a work in progress, and I know we'll eventually get it. And I want to thank the Auditor Generals, the Auditor General in particular, and all and her team for all the great work that they do for these Cayman Islands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, too, Member for Bodden Town East. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the conclusion then of this hearing today. I want to thank you all for your presence, the witnesses, Financial Secretary, the Accountant General, also the Deputy Accountant General, and the Office of the Auditor General, and your support staff as well. I think it's been a very productive afternoon that we can get through this report as well. And also want to thank the clerk sitting next to me for all of her efforts. And, as a committee, we have a little bit more work to do to finalize, to address the content of the report that we will be drafted. But this will conclude certainly the public element of this hearing. So I want to thank everyone again for your presence and wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.